to the Faith Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the fourth Sunday in Lent for the week of March 30th, 2025, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig in this week's podcast, and I'm excited that we are continuing this Lenten journey, and as part of that Lenten journey is sometimes even reflecting back on a few things. And there is one thing, I was listening to a sermon for this last week, and I had to think back to what I was talking about a little bit last week, and there was one correction that I want to make. And if you remember correctly, last week, the gospel text, we were talking about the landowner, the gardener, and the fig tree. And at one moment, I did bring up the idea how the landowner was kind of like the Old Testament God. And I was hearing a sermon about it this last week, and I was thinking about it, and I'm like, they're right. I really don't like the image of the landowner being Old Testament God. And the reason being is, especially when you're looking at Luke's gospel, it looks at God as a father figure, as a positive father figure, not this negative father figure. Now, I think you could argue, especially with the chain of parables that Jesus is using here, maybe, but I think a better one that this Pastor Chris Leach was bringing up was the idea of it more being like expectations that the world has for us. I would even argue it's the echoes of what Satan sometimes tells us. That the landowner is over this certain area and saying, yeah, that's not good enough. And Jesus comes in and says, no, give it some more time. And it's the question of what are we going to do with that time? Are we going to buy into what the landowner was saying? Or are we going to buy into what the gardener is doing and trying to neutralize and put all this fertilizer and things on our roots to actually help us grow? And I think that's then becomes this question, this give and take that was in that gospel for last week. But I think it also kind of plays into a little bit of what the question was for last week, which was, where are we ignoring blessings around us? And where do we need to take a step out in faith? And one of the things that I got was a great story talking about a surgeon friend going through and talking about the miracle of birth in and of itself is just amazing. And when we're thinking about it from that perspective, I do think that is a miracle in and of itself. And that how, especially in developed countries, the amount of successful births is absolutely incredible, and how much God has to continue to be in that process. We got another response talking a little bit about how it's so easy for us, especially in first world nations, to overlook some of the general things of life, health, having security, having faith, all these things that it's easy for us to take for granted. And thus we don't ever get around to thanking God for it and really being truly thankful for that. And I think that in and of itself is a great thing to be thinking about and contemplating ourselves. I think there's a lot of times that we don't spend enough time thanking God, especially in prayer. I think prayer can easily become like a honey-do list type thing with God. And if we're really having a correspondence back and forth, I think there's an aspect where we really do need to be thanking God, not just purely out of boast, but just truly being, you gave me breath today. You gave me the ability to live today. And some of those, I think it's sometimes harder to come off as a boast. It's something that is truly a gift, and recognizing the gift, I think, is a big part of this journey. And especially in this Lenten season, I think there is times where we need to be able to take that moment and really reflect and think about these gifts that we have been given just around us day to day, that it's really easy for us to overlook. So let's just jump into it. The Old Testament text this week is out of Joshua chapter 5, verses 9 to 12. To really understand this text, we have to do a little bit of rewind. Now, remember, the chosen people of Israel, after they leave Egypt, wander around the desert for 40 years. And part of that then becomes this idea of how they need to have food and how they were needing to have manna and quail, and how they've been waiting on these unleavened cakes and such for extended periods of time. This text here in Joshua is when the promise of the promised land is fulfilled. The Israelites are able to go into the promised land and actually eat some of the food that is there. And it's at that moment that then we realize And it is stated that the manna ceased. They have been provided for, so no longer God needs to provide this additional food. The food is now in the land of Canaan that has been promised to the Israelites for generations, and now they are actually able to feast on it. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 32, all 11 verses of it. And this is one of those moments where the psalm is trying to recognize and acknowledge where we fall short. Acknowledging that there are a lot of things where, God, I am not worthy. And there are a lot of things where my sin inhibits our relationship. It causes a strain between us. And thus, I sometimes want to pull away. But in that's where you come for me. And I trust that in those times that I am not fighting you like a horse or a mule with a bridle, that I am more trusting in your goodness and righteousness, that you will deliver me out of those hard times because of the love that you have for me and for God's people. And I think that's where at times we can feel like we're so far gone. But yet we have to remember that God still wants to be around us and he wants to pull us in. And I think it's a good message to remember about a lot of our brothers and sisters in the faith and outside of the faith. When you feel like you have done wrong to people, the human nature is to pull away. And a lot of times then that's the exact moments that we actually need to be going out and reaching out and connecting with those people, because that's what they're truly needing, is someone to be there and this really show that they care through it all. The epistle text or second reading this week is out of 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 16 to 21. This text then is talking about how we, with knowing Christ and understanding Christ, recognize that we then are becoming a new creation, have become a new creation because of Christ coming into our lives and redeeming us, and the reconciliation of which is within the ministry of who Christ is. And in recognizing this change, that we then are ambassadors for Christ, as it says in verse 20, that we are then the ones to bring this message to people, to recognize that we are trying to mimic somebody who did it perfectly, and we're not going to be able to do that perfectly. But it also means that we can easily walk out and be with those who have gone through hardships and things that separate them, and say, this is where God steps in. This is what Jesus came for. This is that bridging point, and I'm trying to mimic that, and at times I fall short too. But yet this is a moment where we can connect over this. The gospel text this week is out of Luke chapter 15, verses 1 to 3 and 11b to 32. This is a very familiar gospel text, but before we get to that, we have to remember that there is one text kind of in between this, and this is about the woman who lost a coin and goes searching high and low and then finds it and throws a huge celebration. So we have the fig tree, the woman with the lost coin, and then we get this, where now you have the tax collectors and they're upset with Jesus, and then we get the parable of the lost son, of the prodigal son, of the judgment-free father, through the judgment hierarchical brother. But the idea here of this parable that Jesus tells, that there are two sons, and this father is farming, and the younger son comes to him and asks for his share of the inheritance. A few days later, gathers that, goes and squanders it all. It's all gone. And when he then is going through a famine that has taken place in the region, he then is eating with pigs and feeding them and is taking this on. And as he's in this spot, he recognizes the people who work for my father are much more elevated than I, and that they are even well fed as I am struggling. I can go back to my father and say, I'm not deserving to be of your son. Treat me as one of your slaves. But when he's still a long ways off, the father recognizes him, has people go and get his robe and his ring with this family seal for insignia to welcome him back in, ask people to kill the fatted calf to celebrate, for this child that was lost is now is found. And this frustrates the elder son, because the elder son has been working extremely hard, doing what they're supposed to be doing, and then goes and talks to the father about this. I've been doing this and I haven't even had this type of celebration, yet the younger son, who has gone and squandered all of this, is getting all this type of celebration. Why are we doing this? Why are we celebrating like this? And this is this moment where, do you not recognize, the father is stating, that you have always been with me and what is mine is yours? And this recognition of, look at all the blessings that are here. And this brother of yours was good as dead and has now come back and is being recognized, and we should then celebrate in this. And recognizing that, yes, things have changed, but in this is also worth celebrating. But before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we do a shameless plugs for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some different ideas, direction, just also go through great commentaries, great ideas, ways to be looking at. And if you don't like it, they have a great archive over there to be looking at and thinking about these texts. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but also they have great art, prayers, hymns, colors, and daily devotions. Remember, part of what we're doing here is trying to prepare for Sunday, whether you're in front of the pews or in the pews on Sunday morning. This then allows for some different resources and ways to be thinking about and preparing us. And especially in this Lenten season, it allows us to get deeper and really connect a little bit more as we are doing our reflections during the Lenten season. So if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection covering a wide variety of topics, going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies that can be brought into your weekly preaching, or a newsletter that comes out and covers along with additional events and ideas and ways to be thinking about maybe your ecological footprint just a little bit. If you enjoy listening to this podcast for a half an hour each week, I know you're going to enjoy those resources. Those will be the first links down in the show notes, and make sure to sign up for those, the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. Finally, I'd also recommend checking out the Gus Davis Faith, Science, and Ethics Camp. I'm really excited about it. I launched into it already, introducing it a little bit last week. The Sweet Life, Getting Granular with Sugar, June 21st through 27th, 2025 at Gustavus Adolphus College. This camp is designed for high school students to talk about faith, science, and ethics, and bringing that all together. And the topic this year, talking about sugar and how that all relates. I have been able to be a part of this camp multiple years now. It's an amazing opportunity. So if you haven't checked that out, I'd highly recommend, especially if you're a high school student, taking a look into that. And I look forward to the possibility of seeing you there. The difficulty with taking a gospel like this is it is extremely familiar. It's one of those that if you've been raised in the church, you were probably taught this as a child. And we have heard this story time and time and time again. And so thus, it gets hard sometimes to really hear it with fresh ears. But I think one of the things that we have to look at in one way is, what is the older brother really concerned or frustrated about? And I would argue that part of it is change. The elder brother has gotten used to this idea of how, okay, my younger brother has now left, and there was probably a mourning period over that to some extent, but we all realize as siblings that there's times where, okay, cool, I'm getting a little space. I don't mind this necessarily. And so they start getting their picture of how things are going to be, and that what is there is now mine. And now the younger brother comes back into the picture, and how does that change things? As much as I love my sibling, my sister, I don't know how well we would do in living under the same roof, especially now that we each have our own homes after multiple years of living apart. We're very different people. I love her to death, but we're very different people and we have different ways of doing things. So there is a little bit of that aspect of now things are changing and I don't know if I necessarily like this. And I think a lot of times we forget these aspects. And it was really interesting as I was researching this, because this is a topic that has come up multiple times in multiple different ways. We always see when you're reintroducing, especially like a keystone species, a species that is seen to have a higher impact within the ecosystem, that there usually is a little bit pushback because they usually are top-down predators. These are predators or something of that nature, and it causes some type of resistance because people are a little concerned about what changes is that actually going to be. But what has also been kind of interesting as I was researching this and looking at scholarly papers about this is there's sometimes it seems like scientists get so excited about this that we actually forget our own scientific method. And a lot of the papers are even stated where there isn't necessarily clear hypothesis on what the impact of all this is going to be. And thus it doesn't give us a great way of being able to look at how reintroduction programs have actually worked, to be able to use those as helpful tools for other reintroduction projects or to see if there's problems with some of these projects. I'll attach some links down below on some of those. I found it very, very fascinating. But why do we even do reintroductions? What is the point of all this? The point is typically that reintroduction programs are the idea that some species has disappeared for some reason. And a lot of times, if we're being honest, it's our human impact in some form or fashion impacted this, but sometimes it's also the aspect that the ecosystem has been shifting, that partially maybe due to us being as humans, but partially just changes in with how things are working, that it's caused for a change in how we're doing this and how things are evolving and how the ecosystem is. And maybe you're infringing on habitat or different things of that nature, making it hard for introduction of species to happen. A good example of this would be cheetahs being returned to India. We took some cheetahs out of southwestern Africa and brought them back to one of their historic ranges of India. Now, this was announced in 2022 that this was going to happen, and it took till late 2024 for actual cheetahs to be released into India, as there was definitely steam being lost in how this was going to all happen. And there has been a lot of difficulty actually getting cheetahs to work. Even in captivity, there's been a lot of deaths. In these couple years, they've had 10 deaths, 7 adults, 3 cubs that they've been trying to get so that they're somewhat established to be able to release. But again, one of the issues is, if you think of India just in general, the amount of growth of people and cities and things of that nature, the historic ranges of the cheetah and needing areas to be able to run makes it a little bit hard in certain spots to be thinking about how cheetahs come back into that picture. So again, it's one of these things where, yes, it's awesome to bring these back, but have we thought through all the different consequences and thought through all the different ramifications that could potentially be coming from this? But I'll attach a story down below going through a lot of these. There's been some that have been more successful, like reintroduction of wild bison into the UK, and how there is now a whole herd that has kind of established itself in southeast England near Kent that have now been able to kind of connect and embed themselves within the ecosystem and really actually made some impact. And there's been a lot of rewilding campaigns throughout Europe and England in general, bringing back vultures to be able to be some of that cleanup crew of especially dead creatures, carrion, to be able to eat and help with that way, bringing back lynx into the area, even bringing back rat kangaroos known as bushtail's betong in Australia and trying to bring them from a different part of Australia to bring them back into these areas, bringing ferrets back into the United States, into the Western U.S., returning of kites, or even the wild horses of China, bringing those back. But these often then also take a tremendous amount of time, and we also have to think about what are the impacts of this. I know one of them that has been a slow reintroduction process has actually been elk within the state of Wisconsin in the United States. That in the 90s, this was talked about and being investigated. Can we bring back caribou, moose, or elk? And it was seen that elk were probably the most probable to bring back. And is there a small herd of elk? Yes. But are we anywhere near where you can have a hunting season on these elk? Probably not. We're still talking, as of 2019, roughly in the ballpark of under 250 individuals. This isn't a huge amount of elk here, and we're hoping to be able to reestablish that. But what is this all coming together? Part of what has happened is that things have changed. The population on whatever you're bringing in to reintroduce is going to have different genetics than whatever the ones were there. They can be similar, but still different. And we really don't necessarily have what was the unique attributes to Wisconsin elk versus Colorado elk if you're bringing them in from Colorado. And suddenly then they have to evolve and change to have those differences. The other thing you have to remember then is what has happened in that time since they were there to impact other things. Take white-tailed deer, for instance, if we're looking at the elk example. How are white-tailed deer going to be impacted? And that's a big cash animal within the state of Wisconsin. It is a highly gamified animal that has value, and they want to make sure that that's there. But elk could potentially also bring some additional health to the ecosystem since it grew up with the ecosystem initially. But that also means that there's going to be changes. And sometimes, as we know, we as people struggle with the idea of change. We struggle with the idea of how things might be different. And it might mean that there's some sacrifices that we have to be willing to be able to do in order for something outside of us to benefit. It's one of the big things with a lot of these reintroduction projects, especially if you're bringing in a predator, is what is the impact long term? Because you have had people who have grown accustomed to a specific way of things being without that being there. And when you're suddenly saying we're seeing that there was impacts that we didn't expect when we removed this, and now you've had people living in that gap or animals living in that gap, and you take that gap away, what does that do? How does that change things? And yes, it might be for the betterment in the long term, but it also at that moment can be really, really hard and difficult. And I think that's one of the things as a church, as a body, as individuals, I think with even in our own faith, there's a lot of times that we have to allow ourselves the possibility of growth. We have to allow ourselves the ability to be able to thank God for the time that we had in this way, but also recognizing that God is still also in whatever is coming as well. That the change that's coming is going to also still be a moment where we need to continue to trust God, even though it might be drastically different. And I think sometimes that's really hard. I think it's hard for me to imagine what do cheetahs look like in India? And I guess I've never been to India. I don't know. Maybe there are spots where it would really make sense. And I got to trust the scientists who have done that. But also, what are the other impacts of what that's going to do for the ecosystem and people in general? How is that going to affect things? And how is that going to help their ecosystem? And what's going to be different from that? These are all questions and things that we have to be willing and open to thinking about. And I think being open to the change. The elder brother has gotten accustomed to the way that things have been, and then is getting jealous on the change that is happening. The brother isn't looking at the possibilities of the good things that are coming from this. Instead, the elder brother is seeing this as an opportunity that things were taking away from him. The father then is starting to help show that, no, this is not something that is being taken away from you. It is something that is actually blessing you. And you need to see it that way as well. And I think there's a lot of times it's easy for us to see change as something that isn't a blessing, unless it's directly benefiting you. And sometimes that's hard. Sometimes it means also whatever your opinion is, you need to be open to hearing what other opinions are to be able to understand other realities and how maybe something was really benefiting you, but hurting something else that you weren't aware of. And yes, it might be harmful for you to lose this thing, but recognizing compassion and care for others might be important. I think there's a lot of times within our world, we like putting ourselves as humans above things. And sometimes we have to be able to acknowledge that there's more to this world. If it's just humans, with all due respect, we lose a lot of the beauty of what God has also done. God didn't just create humans. God created a lot more than that. And that's part of the beauty of God's creation, is recognizing what is outside of just humans. And I think that's hard. It's this weird balance that we're in when we want to turn back the clock and bring back these species, but that also means changing the current. And what does that mean? And what does that look like? But also sometimes recognizing that some of these reintroduction programs aren't going to be successful either, because things have changed enough that it just isn't going to work. And we have to be accepting of that as well. And maybe be looking at, okay, if it filled this part of the ecosystem, what is doing that now? Is there ways that we can help it if we're seeing that as truly an issue with an ecosystem? Sometimes it means reintroduction is the right idea. Sometimes it might mean that, no, this is continuing to evolve and maybe something else will fill that niche. And I think that's what gets hard. We can get opinions on either side. And I think that's where the Father coming in and just seeing change isn't bad. Either way you shake it. But recognizing what has happened is important. Recognizing that this brother, yes, went through all this, but recognizing the blessing that what is mine is yours and what is yours is mine is, yes, important. And also recognizing that, yes, your brother was gone and you enjoyed that and look at all this and you didn't throw a party, you never asked. But now what we assumed was gone is now returned. And what a blessing that is, and that is worth celebrating as well. And I think that's an aspect that we don't look at and think about enough. These reintroductions can be blessings, but it also means change. And the things that we've known, it might change then as well. And as humans, we have to be okay with that and accept that. And that can be hard. So the question I have for you this week is twofold. One, what are some blessings that you've often overlooked? And two, what changes in your life have you questioned and ended up being for the benefit of others ahead of yourself? I think a lot of times in this world, we like thinking about ourselves first. For obvious reason. We have a selfish ambition and selfish guilty pleasure of making sure that we're okay and our family's okay. That makes sense. But we also have to remember that we have a God who's selfless, who's looking out for others, caring for others. And I think that also extends beyond just the human race as well. And sometimes that means putting us in hard situations to really think about things, to reflect on things, to take a tough pill and swallow. But it's in these times that we truly have growth. It's in these times that I think we really actually truly get to more of who the heart of Jesus is. When we get beyond just ourselves and start really looking beyond ourselves, whether to human or non-human, I think that's those moments that we really start to get a little bit of the glimpse of the love and care that God has for us that's unconditional. When we start looking beyond ourselves and our self-interests, no matter how hard that is. Sometimes recognizing that reintroduction of a species is going to change things, and maybe it's reverting things back to the way that things were, and maybe it'll be successful, maybe it won't. And both, whether you're in part of the side that's reintroducing the species, or maybe you're part of the side that's questioning that, we have to be able to listen and hear and work together. We have to be okay with and thank God for the times that we've had and trust that God's still in wherever we're going. It's part of faith. It's part of life, part of what we are called to do. Sometimes that care and love is sometimes hard for us to do. But that is part of what we are called in 2 Corinthians to do. It's part of what we see in Joshua, that the things that were are no longer needed then. And we have to embrace that and recognizing that no matter what we do and the mistakes that we make, that God's still going to love us through it. But we have to continue to turn our eyes toward God and truly be looking for what God is saying, no matter how hard that is. And that's sometimes the hardest part. Taking the bits of advice that God is stating and not being like a horse or a mule and being stubborn in the bridle, but letting God lead us through what we're scared of, truly, or nervous about, or uneasy about, whatever that change may be. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.